hotel, but, the 8-year-old will do that with us the whole time. Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Wayne, can you hear us? Great. Good morning, Mary, good morning, Ashley and Amy and Elizabeth Guzman. We are here in the conference room with the Independent Budget Office, and I think we're waiting for a couple more people. So we're just gonna put you on mute while we wait.
Good morning.
And just to let you know, the meeting is being recorded and live streamed onto IBO's YouTube channel.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Very subtly.
The meeting is now streaming.
There might be
Really optimistic.
I think there might there with the debate.
That like curve backwards.
Is there a chance?
You're not too silly.
No, it's perfect. Keep it in the freezer. I think you used to be really like good at subtle. Oh, yeah, when do you?
Okay, good morning. We're just about to start. I'm Louisa Chafee. I'm the Director of the Independent Budget Office. Good morning and welcome to the quarterly meeting. Welcome to all of our advisory board members and other supporters of the IBO on the screen. I just wanted to tell you that you are missing Dunkin' Donuts. So that's, for some, a really major reason to get here. But with me in the room today is Dean, our board chair. And so I think I say welcome and introductions, and then I turn it over to you.
Okay.
And if it's okay, we're going to share the Zoom. Excuse me, the PowerPoint.
All right.
Is it,
Everybody
is
seeing
it, can you check that it's been shared? There, sorry, wrong one.
Seeing it.
Give us a minute. It's just a minute.
All right, good morning, everyone. Let's get right into it. The minutes were circulated of our last quarterly meeting. Move to approve. Do I have can somebody move, please?
I'll motion.
Thank you. Second?
Second,
Thank you. All in favor?
aye,
And I approve. And therefore we can move right into the recent. Well, you have welcome and some
Yeah.
introductions. So
I was
let's
just
pause
going
there.
to welcome two new hires, Elliot, welcome, and Sinru, who is not yet here. And we also have 4 new interns starting this fall, so we're very excited for that. And we also want to take a moment to thank and appreciate Lisa Neary, who has joined the wonderful world of pickleball and departed IBO for her semi-retirement this summer. So congratulations to all. And then we have an org chart, which shows us now close to 50 boxes, almost 50 full-time equivalent employees. Wow. We're getting close to our mandate. Okay.
I'll just ask, are there any questions on the organization chart since you gave it to
Yeah.
us? Okay, all right, and then I jumped ahead and already did the minutes, so we'll go right to the recent work product. And I'm gonna hand it back.
So we just wanted to give you an oversight of actions that we've done since our last quarterly meeting, work product, either public statements or publications or testimony. And today we wanted to focus in on 2 very specific pieces. The first of which is the New York State Foundation Aid formula discussion with the Rockefeller Institute, which will be led by Julia Conrad. That was initially testimony and then follow up with the Rockefeller Institute.
Go to the next slide. Okay, so I'll start by walking a little bit through Foundation Aid, and then I'll go into some of the more details here. But New York State distributes funding to school districts through the Foundation Aid formula. Foundation Aid comprises the majority of state education aid to school districts, including New York City. And the state's Foundation Aid was introduced in 2007. That was in response to a court ruling from the Campaign for Fiscal Equity court case. Its intention is to promote equity in state educational aid. And so I'm going to talk a little bit broadly about what it includes, and then I'll get into more of what our testimony has been, our conversations with the Rockefeller Institute. and then what IBO is doing next to stay a part of this conversation. So the formula considers a district's student enrollment. It also considers several student need weights, and it makes some adjustments for regional costs and the district's wealth. And so just for context, for the 24-25 school year, so this next school year, that aid for New York City amounts to $9.9 billion. A little background on the formula as it is now. So district's total amount is calculated by multiplying what's called a selected foundation aid by the district's weighted pupil count. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about what that means, but really we'll get into it more as we talk about our conversations with Rockefeller Institute and what we've flagged in those conversations. So this district's total amount that's calculated, there's two pieces, a selected foundation aid and the weighted pupil count. The selected foundation aid basically creates a per pupil amount for each district. And then that per pupil amount is multiplied by the district's, it's multiplied by the district's weighted pupil count. That's a count of student enrollment, but it's also adjusted for student need, some student need. Just to clarify, there are other forms of state aid to districts and they're in other buckets, but foundation aid is really the majority. So in the 2025 enacted state budget, there was $2 million put into that budget for a foundation aid study that would be led by the State University of New York Rockefeller Institute of Government. And that is a study to look at what the formula includes and what changes might be made, because it hasn't been updated really at its core since 2007. And so the Rockefeller Institute facilitated public hearings over the summer, and at one of those hearings, IBO was an invited speaker. In our testimony, we thought really about what we could contribute from our expertise. So we focused especially on comparisons between the state formula and New York City's funding formula, the Fair Student Funding Formula. So just as a reminder, foundation aid is directing funding from the state to local districts. New York City's Fair Student Funding Formula directs funding from the city's Department of Education to local schools. But it's a way for us to look at what you could do differently. And so we used it in our testimony as a comparison. The Fair Student Funding Formula is also based on several components. So there is what we call a Fair Student Funding Entitlement Amount. It also is derived from a base per pupil amount and then a school's enrollment, which is adjusted for new weights. And so what we flagged in our testimony especially was that New York State Fair Student Funding Formula, New York City Fair Student Funding Formula, it's changed over time, unlike the foundation aid. And it's changed both in terms of the student need weights it's considering and also in the magnitude of those weights. So it's really adapted as different things have driven that change. It's both state policy, city policy, and then most recently advocacy from a New York City task force. So the New York City funding formula, and we pointed this out in our testimony, it includes weights that the state does not. Weights like grade level, academic intervention. Our city formula also includes different weights for types of programming for English language learners and special education. The state includes one weight for each of those categories, but it doesn't differentiate by the cost of programming. We also have a weight for portfolio high schools, and then newly last year, the city included weights for students in temporary housing and schools with high concentration of needs. So again, just for context, and we provided this in our testimony, in the 23-24 school year, the new weight for students in temporary housing applied to 95,000 students in New York City, out of about 800,000 who were served through the formula. And 303 schools got additional funding through that new weight, the concentration for high need schools. We also flagged in our testimony that there should be considered updates to the underlying data. That's another IBO focus for us. The poverty counts in the foundation aid formula derived from the 2000 decennial census. And there's a regional cost index to adjust by region in New York State. And that index has been frozen at 2006 levels. So those are some easy places that you could see a data update. And then a more thorny and interesting conversation is about the base per pupil allocation. So I said that sort of at the core of the formula is an understanding of what is the base per pupil amount before you adjust for all these other things. That base per pupil allocation derives from a state analysis that identifies across the state what are successful school districts. And those are based on state achievement measures. And they use those districts to estimate per pupil costs. And IBO highlighted that that analysis hasn't been updated since 2016, 2017. And as we know, there's a lot of context that has changed since then, the least of which is the COVID pandemic. So what are the needs of students might have changed, and the cost of educating students under our state constitutional mandate have changed maybe as well. We also shared our concerns about those achievement measures. There are rising opt-out rates for state achievement exams in New York State specifically. So how do we factor in a consideration of how do you identify a successful school district if some districts don't have full participation in those state exams? There's other testimony that I think some of us maybe on this call participated in as well, but I'm going to focus next on our follow-up conversation. So thanks to Louisa, after our testimony, about a month later, we had the opportunity to meet with the president of the Institute, Robert Negna, and the director of education policy studies, Brian Backstrom. And in that conversation, in particular, we wanted to discuss a few nuances of those pieces. So I'm going to share a little bit of that and what we heard from them, and then what we're going to do next. So we really wanted to highlight in our follow-up conversation the extent to which we think the Institute could consider the potential for the foundation aid formula to allow for these changing education costs. How do you create a formula that can adapt to things like new weights, the changes in magnitude to weights? New York City's funding formula has done that over time. Will they consider recommendations for that as well? And then the thorny issue of that base per pupil allocation, we really wanted to highlight that that is the core of the foundation aid formula. And so we were interested in knowing to what extent they were going to consider doing a new estimate, other ways to do that estimate, because other states, even in nearby New Jersey, use a totally different methodology to calculate that base per pupil. So some learnings that we received from that conversation, we do think it seems like they're interested in regular review of the formula, so there might be recommendations for that. There seems to be some interest too in refreshing data. So how can we think about recommendations that will allow for that regularly? But also the Rockefeller Institute is interested in thinking about limitations to the measures in the formula now. So there might be suggested options of what the legislature could do. And I'd say the other takeaway for us especially is that the Rockefeller Institute sees their role as providing recommendations and maybe raising up the conversation around different issues, but they aren't focused on those larger questions of how do we define student success. That's the purview of other spaces, is the impression we got. And they also are interested not in stepping into a legislature role. So these recommendations will be offered in December, and then it'll be up to the legislature to think about which of those in a conversation with the governor about what happens next. So for IBO, what happens next is we are requesting underlying data from the New York State Education Department. I think of the formula sometimes as like a Russian nesting doll. You open up one and then you find another and then you open up another and you open it. So we want the data all the way at the core. It is not publicly accessible, but we're going to look for it. We're going to request it so that we can do our own simulations of what those changes to the formula would look like. And then we're also preparing other research to sort of continue to build our expertise that we've already had for many years on the New York City Fair Student Funding Formula. And I want to highlight two researchers, especially in their work. Yan-Wan Song is working on examining schools that are considered high need by New York City's Fair Student Funding Formula and what impact that has on their ability to hire teachers and what kind of teachers they have at their schools. So really considering the funding formula we have and how it might be applicable to others. And then Caitlin O'Hagan, Yan-Wan Song, and Hannah Leverance are also especially looking at now the impact of those new weights. So the weight for students in temporary housing, and for schools with high concentrations of student need, what is the impact on school budgets? Because I told you earlier how many students and schools that affected, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it had an impact on school budgets. So they're exploring that question of what do we see as a budget change as a result of new weights. So that's where we're going next, and I'm happy to take any questions about any of it.
Questions on that? I definitely have questions, but I want to allow other people to jump in.
Sure.
Any? So let me start then. this all came about because of the controversy in last budget where the governor proposed the elimination of the Save Harmless. Because huge student population's been lost. The compromise was to do this, to have the Rockefeller Institute do this study. Did we weigh in on the Save Harmless piece?
No, we didn't. So we focused especially on our testimony on the foundation aid formula because our impression is that's where the conversation will be next. So the governor proposed eliminating those provisions. The legislator did not include that. The state budget did adjust the inflation factor. So the inflation factors applied to year over year foundation aid, and that was increased. And then just to note, the other pieces of that state budget conversation that ended up is there was an extension of mayoral control for 2 years through June 2026. And there was also an expansion of the panel for educational policies. So those were sort of the state budget changes. But for our testimony and so far our research, we're focusing especially on the formula.
Okay, I do think it would be interesting, what would the consequences be of different Save Harmless and to what New York City would then receive and what the high needs districts would then receive.
Okay.
Right, I mean, in the end, it's going to have a higher distribution. The other piece that I think that may be interested is, while this is the hugest chunk of school aid, there's still total school aid, and there's a lot of manipulation. I should say that. There's a lot of additional needs that are addressed in the remaining school aid. So it doesn't hurt, and it may be interesting to look from 2008, the first year of it, to now, how that distribution has changed for high need districts. Obviously, in particular, the one we're most focused on, New York City. I just think it's a good benchmark to give context to, while the formula was attempting to address adequacy in high need districts, that what's the overall amount that the state's contributing may be a nice benchmark for us.
Absolutely.
Now let me turn it back to anyone else. So really well done. Okay. Henry.
Yes, good morning. Nina, I have a question as it applies to the timeline that the state is considering, given the fact the state legislature has not approved the budget within the time, on time by July, I'm sorry, by April 1st. Is it that there will be recommendations by the IBO, hearings will take place thereafter, and then the implementation of the formula, because that's where all the negotiations take place?
So our understanding is the Rockefeller Institute will release their recommendations in December. I don't expect those recommendations to say, here is a total new proposal for foundation aid formula. I would expect that they are going to point in different directions where the formula could be updated. And then there's going to be a huge public debate about that. And I would imagine it would be the subject of hearings. I don't know if it'll be something that'll be taken up by the legislature to change. That did feel like the promise of the study is there would be some changes. Will they be really at the core of the formula, or will they be sort of around the edges about data updates? We don't know the answer to that yet, but we're hoping to be prepared for those recommendations. We have a sense of what they might be, and then we can respond with our own analysis that says, here's what we think will happen if you take these different approaches.
Right, the only thing I would add, and it sounds consistent with Henry, with your conversations with Bob Magnot.
Yeah.
I mean, December gives the governor the ability to put some of those recommendations in the executive budget, and then it actually becomes part of the conversation.
Right.
The second question is regarding the update of data, just the concept of data, and particularly as it applies to poverty, and when in fact that's ever going to be fair in a fair student funding formula, particularly some districts where high minorities are, and when in fact the data that's being recommended or the update around the data is less around census and more about updated like real honest data that is taking place now.
Yeah, and I
Thank
think oh, sorry.
No, thank you. I apologize.
No, and I'll say that I glossed over it a little bit, but the poverty measure incorporates both 2000 decennial census at the moment and also a measure of free and reduced price lunch. So it does have those two pieces. It's definitely, I think, a concern we have heard from New York City stakeholders that were we to update parts of that measure, it could reduce the overall allocation to New York City. We haven't done our own estimate of that, so I don't want to say if that's true or not. But those are definitely questions of how do you measure poverty. For comparison, in the New York City Fair Student Funding formula, we do have places where you see that woven in. But our main was the academic intervention weight is about whether or not students are meeting academic standards. And if they are below or on track, that's where we put the weight in the funding formula. So that's one place where you see poverty might show up as a sort of, it's used as a proxy when we don't have a state exam for a student. And then in that concentration of high need. So I think it is a really hard thing to measure. And that's something that the Rockefeller Institute is probably gonna have to think through too.
I will say we brought that up also in our conversations with them about a lot of the work going on in New York City on the true cost of living. So even, reliance on the federal poverty measure is how accurate is that? So we definitely hear you on that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I will just say this: the bending of the formula for Staten Island, in terms of the poverty measure, as it applies to the threshold of students on the poverty by lunch, by the applications, I think it still remains to be something that should be and ought to be questioned. While I understand District 31 being what it is, as an isolated district outside in an island that requires different changes, the measure standards for Staten Island formula is so much more beneficial to that of other districts that one had to be questioning why that continues to be the case. I'll just say my piece because today's September 11th and I am in peace, so leave it there. Thank you.
All right, anyone else? Okay, again, thank you, really well done.
I have something to click through.
Okay, so next we have Claire and
Uh,
Cameron to talk
Want me to go
about.
back and forth?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna. There we go.
Thank you. And cash assistance processing.
That's right.
Yeah, so basically the genesis of this project, like what prompted our research was a lawsuit by Legal Aid against the city due to the accumulation of overdue applications for SNAP and cash assistance, because these applications are meant to be processed within a specific window as mandated by the state and federal governments, and HRA was consistently failing to meet that window. So first we looked at the MMR, the mayoral management report to examine like how timeliness has looked over the last couple of years. And it's far below the targets. And we essentially wanted to look into the contributing factors as to why, and found, and some of the things we looked at were cases, head count, and
tech systems. So the other thing I would add about the lawsuit is that after the city was ordered to clear the backlog of cases, they actually got more behind. And then very quickly, it's like maybe a month before their deadline to clear the backlog, they announced it had been cleared. So that also a lot of advocates have been asking questions about how were they able to clear the backlog so quickly. So what we found is that there was sort of a perfect storm of things happening at HRA. So first, cases have been increasing since the pandemic, and they have not slowed down. You can see them getting a little bit higher once pandemic benefits go away. So like once pandemic unemployment insurance benefits ended, you can see that there are more applications for SNAP and for cash assistance. At the same time as cases increase, the staff declines at HRA. They lost a lot of people during the pandemic, like a lot of agencies did, but they haven't been able to staff back up. So you'll see in a few slides, they have many more cases and fewer people. So they have the same number of cases they had coming out of the recession, but they have about 20% fewer staff. Um,
And not only fewer staff, but the composition of that staff has changed. The staff has become less experienced. There's a lower proportion of supervisors as a percentage of total staff, and those supervisors themselves have also have less experience than they did prior. So just factors like that are also kind of what we believe the things that contribute, like just less experienced staff, there's more turnover, more newer people, and just overall, yeah, the main takeaway would be just less people to deal with a
Yeah.
significant surge in cases that began in 2020 following the pandemic.
Yeah, the process has also gotten a lot more complicated. There were many waivers that changed the process throughout the pandemic. Some of them have ended, a lot of them are still in place. Cash assistance work requirements are rolling out again this fall, which even if that reduces the total number of people receiving cash assistance, that will mean a lot more work for the processing because it's a lot more complicated to verify those rules. So the process is going to continue to be complicated. It's sort of the main takeaway. There's more people, there's more people receiving these benefits. The process is more complicated and HRA has less staff.
And then one thing I would add, this is not an unprecedented number of cases like we saw because we looked back 10 years. They did have a similar amount of cases in 2013, but at that time they had 20% more staff to deal with those cases. And then this is a good example of that. And not only that, but you can kind of see in the graph, the composition of the cases has slightly changed, whereas in 2013, it was far more, 2013 was the peak for SNAP cases, about 1.8 million, while currently there's about 1.7 million SNAP cases, but there's far more cash assistance cases. Cash assistance is by far higher than it's been, and we've also found that it has been increasing not only year over year, but month over month in the current year. So the caseload is increasing. One other thing that's kind of tangential to this project, but not exactly what we looked into, would be recent regulation around asylum seekers and their eligibility for cash assistance. So we believe that's another thing that could exacerbate the issue because there will be likely more applications for cash assistance because with asylum seekers, the 60-day limit at.
So you're thinking about shelter.
Oh, yeah.
So for
Shelter, no.
last year, the state expanded, one of the things they did is they expanded safety net assistance, which is the primarily city-funded state cash assistance program, is now eligible. Asylum seekers can be eligible if they apply for asylum or CPS, if they get status permanent residence under color of the law is the term, approval. We haven't seen an increase so far in safety net assistance applications. Those have been growing about 20% since before that rule change, like every month. There are just way more people. So if we go back, this is the increase in applications, new applications every month. So there's a spike in 2020, and then they're steadily growing. That sort of sharper increase is when pandemic unemployment ends and also the eviction moratorium put more stress on households. But you can see it just going up a lot. And then this is the timeliness change. So this is for applications taking longer than 30 days. You can see that it gets really high for both cash assistance and SNAP. The city has gotten better at SNAP over time and cash assistance, but still the latest data they gave us, about a third of new applications were still taking longer than 30 days to process.
And if there's any lack of clarity at like what timeliness actually means, timeliness is essentially the percentage of applications that are processed within the mandated window. So you can see like in late 2013 and in late 2023, almost all applications were essentially not being processed in a timely manner. And yeah, that's been something that has improved as of late, but caseload hasn't decreased and their staffing levels have stagnated. They're still far less staffed than they were at the time that they were processing a similar amount of cases. So it's hard. Well, yeah, I mean, that's basically.
Yeah. They clearly need more people. So the other thing we have here is just the MMR. So you can see over the last 10 years, it's hidden by that window. But you can see it basically just falling. A complication is that the MMR window itself changed. So that's why in the previous slide, we're using the definition of taking longer than 30 days. Because the MMR window is including a change in the window.
Yeah, particularly for cash assistance, it was changed from 45 days to 30 days. But that was following fiscal year 2022. And that's important to note because even in fiscal year 2022, when the window was 45 days, that would still have been the lowest timeliness rate reported in 10 years. So imagine you're essentially as inefficient as you had been in a decade, and then you were given even less time to process the applications that you were already processing inefficiently.
And then the very last thing I think we haven't mentioned is that the city also rolled out a new tech system for processing SNAP. So just as part of the applications are more complicated to process, there's more rules. There's also a whole new tech system that staff have had to learn for SNAP. The state still uses its old legacy system, which is many years old. So the city is trying to update their system, but their new system, staff will have to learn, and they have to learn how it integrates with the older legacy state system. So it really is just all these things happening at the same time. So.
And one more thing, kind of in that same vein, there was actually in a recent public testimony given by employees that work at HRA, particularly eligibility specialists, which are the employees that are most specialized to work on processing SNAP cases specifically. They spoke to some of the challenges that we've spoken to here, particularly the turnover. There's not quite, they basically said they themselves believe there isn't like not appropriate, but there isn't an adequate mode of communication between like staff and upper management. And they also feel like there's a lot of IT issues, like issues communicating with IT, submitting tickets. They have issues in that regard where certain things won't get addressed for months. Some things get addressed right away. Sometimes things that aren't the issue get addressed, and then like IT tells them essentially that it must be something on your end. They feel like it's not. And then another big thing that they mentioned was training. Generally speaking, they got about, I think they had a 6-week training program to essentially get new staff up to speed, which is important because as we touched on before, there's a lot more new staff now than there was in previous years. That training window was shortened to 3 weeks. So they get less training and they have less supervisors. And so there's less supervisors that have to essentially perform streamlined training on even more new staff. And they themselves feel like they can sense that the supervisors feel like they're overloaded. More experienced staff feel like newer staff doesn't have appropriate training, so they don't necessarily put it on the newer staff's plate for not necessarily being able to perform as well as they possibly could, because there's just a lot of things going on that are kind of, yeah, like Claire said, it's kind of like a conglomeration of just difficult externalities that make efficiency an issue.
And there are fewer, the training got shortened because there are not enough trainers. So the big picture takeaway is HRA needs more people, and it needs more people specifically in this area. And that this is an issue that is not going away because that caseload is increasing and it's continuing to increase.
Particularly cash assistance, which, yeah, every month since, I don't remember when, but at least for a year, every month there's been more and more,
People.
yeah, new applications for cash assistance.
We have questions. I can see we have one. There, Henry?
I think Mary.
Or Mary?
Henry, do you have a question or is it from before?
Actually, I have a comment because it's been positively held dealing with OMB on this issue. As you may be aware, DC 37 represents both the eligibility specialist, job opportunity specialist, and the case managers that was referred to, and the caseworkers that was referred to. And for months, we've been fighting this 2-for-1 ratio hiring that OMB continues to implement. Even though they said that they're exempt, they're not really exempting HRA. They've just been implementing pockets of releases, 100, 150, 200, 300 on the hiring side. And, you know, there was a comment regarding, you know, how you bring in people and onboarding people, right? We try to do the hiring holes and attempted to do all this, increase the pay, by the way, through an equity fund, gave incentives for workers that will remain in place, but OMB refused to include eligibility specialists as part of it. Willing to do case managers, they're willing to do job opportunity specialists, but will not do eligibility specialists as a way of a bonus, even though the funding was there, identified in collective bargaining. So this is not an accident. This is a concerted effort, I want to say, in my opinion, by OMB to try to reduce the headcount. And I think we've had comments before to pay for the collective bargaining agreement. So they're taking and reducing the headcount in order to pay for some of the increases in our collective bargaining agreement has been pretty clear. And I just want to put a plug in. Yesterday I had a meeting with the new DCAS commissioner. Also, the other problem with this, which wasn't identified, is the testing. The civil service testing that allows people to be onboarded has completely stopped, almost to a crawl. And so HRA proposed that the hiring be done through a process that the state identified called HELP, which bypasses the civil service position and waives the payment, but it was never implemented. So there've been efforts, I have to say, by HRA, but this is a OMB issue, in my opinion, that is not just because the agency is not trying. Now, I wanted to say that for the record, because Molly and I certainly have had bi-weekly meetings on this, trying to onboard more people, only to be thwarted by OMB's effort constantly stopping, positions and hiring and delaying. And it's been very frustrating in this process.
Yeah,
But I
actually-
thank you for the report, right?
Yeah,
And the
that's
comment.
very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, that is very helpful, and kind of to reinforce what you're saying about HRA, like they are trying, they did. As of, I believe, fiscal year 2024, they did create a new position, benefits opportunity specialist, which is essentially more or less a job opportunity specialist, but meant to I guess be even more specialized in regards to processing cash assistance cases. And we did actually find that benefits opportunity specialists, the median and mean pay for that position is actually higher than it has been for job opportunity specialists. So that is something they did, a new position specifically for this issue, specifically for cash assistance, and they are paying them more. And then kind of to go to your OMB point, yeah, we did find that they have had a reduced headcount, budgeted headcount for a while. And yeah, like even, I'm not sure if we mentioned that they're 10% below their budgeted headcount as of this fiscal year. It will probably be a lot higher if there was more, like the budget headcount was greater, but that's also, yeah, like the budget headcount has gone down substantially year over year, and that's while cases are rising, which seems counterintuitive on its face.
But they still can't even fill the lower budgeted headcount.
Yeah, so if it were higher, it's not to say they would definitely have more people, because obviously even with the lower budgeted headcount, they're still 10% below what they have budgeted. But yeah, it definitely doesn't help that even at full capacity, you would think that they would be, well, you would think that there would be an increase in what they have budgeted to accommodate with the case increase.
I appreciate that. I just want to make the point, not to kill a dead horse, that the fact that they've excluded ESs purposely from the bonuses that we did over the other workers and the jobs, and you mentioned the benefit specialist, the new position, they purposely excluded that group. So what's happening is you also have a migration of folks going from one job to the other, because the qualifications are essentially the same, right? The job loads is pretty much the same. But because you're chosen to do one, allow one to have the benefit and the bonuses and not the other ones, people are leaving from one position to the other. So there's a lot of lateral movement here that seems that there's like hiring, but there's no hiring. There's folks are going from one position to the other. And you got to look into that too, because you're just taking from Peter to pay Paul in this case, and not leading to the proper staffing to get that count down. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
First, good research. I appreciate the stats on this and how to tie this together, what's happening. And thanks for Henry for the additional context. We talk a lot about the cases and we talk about renewals and applications, but we all know there's a human element to this, which is the recipients need this to support themselves and support their families. So I was curious if, besides, I think there's a couple references to testimonies from benefit recipients about what's happening, but I'm wondering if there's any more stats or metrics that you're able to get about how the delayed processing are impacting recipients themselves.
So I would say, unfortunately, we don't have any data. I think the phrase that gets used a lot is you can't eat retroactively. Because if your SNAP case is overdue, you will eventually get it, but that doesn't make up for the long period of time that you did not have what you needed, and that there's also a lot of health impacts that go along with having delayed food stamps. We just don't have access to any data, but we are open to metrics if you have any suggestions.
Yeah, and I know you said kind of like aside from the public testimony that we referenced, but I do think it's important to mention that in the public testimony, the staff members at HRA did emphasize the toll that it not only takes on them to kind of have to speak with individuals who are not getting their benefits in a timely manner, but the sentiment expressed by the individuals themselves that aren't getting these benefits, the toll that it takes on them. They're saying, like, you have someone crying on the phone, essentially being like, I need to feed my family, like, we're not getting what we need. Like, and they essentially on their end, they're like, we're doing everything we can, but they understand that, like, there's only so much they can do to expedite the process. There's only so much they can do to process the applications as quickly as possible. So I just wanted to, I think it is important to note that that is something that even the employees are expressing, like, they're aware they're dealing with these people as well. They are making these people's rights known. So that was something that was brought before the city council. That's something that we are aware of. We'll try to speak to that, but yeah, as Claire said, we don't have any like firsthand data on that.
Thank you.
And to Wayne's point, do we have a distribution of where you're using averages here, but you must actually have the distribution of how long it actually takes for a certain.
So we don't have that. We have the number that the applications every month that it takes longer than 30 days. We have tried and we have not been able to get how long it actually takes.
Because that would
Yeah,
get
because
to-
that like,
that gets to Wayne's point
it,
about.
it definitely would. Yeah, and we just, unfortunately, we were not able to get that.
Not for lack of trying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've been trying to get data on this actually for over a year. So it has been a long,
No,
yeah, it's been a long process, yeah.
and to Henry's point, do we know the authorized headcount? It sounds like you do.
So-
The authorized
Yeah.
versus the actual fill, and what the trend line's been for both authorized and fill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to Henry's
Yeah.
point, to see what both of those are.
Yeah, and we didn't get into, so that there's been a variety of hiring changes, and there is supposed to be an exception for these positions to that 2-for-1 hiring because they're for essential benefits.
Right.
So it's super helpful, and we might follow up afterwards to talk about what that's actually looking like in practice. If that's not how hiring is actually going.
And I don't recall the exact numbers, but every year since the pandemic and since the case increase, there have been less and less budgeted positions. And obviously that's while the gap between the actual bill and what's been budgeted has remained like pretty large.
Dean, sorry, I was just gonna say, and again, I said I was gonna be quiet, but there's a problem with the licensing on this IT that is used by HRA. The workers testified to that effect. We're hearing so much from the workers about the problems they're having in the system in processing folks and backing up. And, we've had conversations with HRA about the update in the system. And they apparently have a proposal to upgrade their system for processing, but have not been approved by OMB. Again, it's not just it's a human factor, as Wayne said. There's so much you're talking about, but this is one area that we really need to look into in investing, because the system is very arcane and it's creating havoc among the workers, even in frustration where we process people and then they get dropped and then they have to start all over again, or the system freezes and they have to, like tell a person, I got to call you back, or we're going to contact you back. There's been a lot of that in terms of reports from the workers processing perspective. Thank you.
Mary?
Hi. Yeah, I had a few questions concerning the data, trying to understand the data. I suppose this is all an aggregate number of people applying. And is there, I have a few questions now. The first one is to see if it's possible to distinguish between asylum seekers and people who have been living here for a long time, or New Yorkers. That's one question. And are the applicants for SNAP and cash assistance is there an overlap? That's a second question. And if there is, how come the last graph is diverging? If there's a big overlap, so cash rejection rates falling and SNAP rejection rates rising, and so how would that be affecting the previous graphs?
Sure. So sorry, we skipped over rejection. So the first thing I'll say about asylum seekers is we're not able to distinguish between those two groups. Because once you are eligible to apply for safety net assistance, for the state CAF assistance program, all that matters is your eligibility. And so once the state got rid of the residency requirements, in terms of immigration status, you can't distinguish, but we don't see a change in the growth rate for that program. So if you look like a year before the state expanded to include asylum seekers, it's a steady increase, like the average growth every month is the same. So we don't believe that there's been a huge increase in that program because of asylum seekers. Then in terms of rejections, so what you can see here, it's a little bit confusing, it's sort of opposite trends. Cash assistance rejections went up at the same time that they had the most overdue applications. And then SNAP was sort of the opposite. Their rejection rate stayed mostly the same. And then when they started rejecting a lot of people is when their overdue application rate went way down. This is a very recent trend, so we don't know if it's going to hold and there are other possible causes. So for cash assistance, the main reason people got rejected was missing their eligibility interview. And during this period where rejections went down, not only did they have fewer overdue applications, but they also changed the system to allow applicants to call in for an interview instead of having to wait for a call. So that could also be contributing to the sort of lower rejection rate. And then for SNAP, during this period, there were they're improving their overdue applications, but there was a change in the income eligibility for SNAP. It got lowered. So this looks like a big change, but we actually really need a few more quarters to see if this is going to hold. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. And why did we observe this big drop in the previous graph, and then the other one too, very recently? Yeah. Maybe this was explained. I missed it.
It's so in theory, this is the city improving its processing rate. We don't fully know why. They did hire more people, so there are more people there. But that's why we included the rejection data, is to say, at least for SNAP, as the timeliness rate is getting better, they're rejecting a lot more people. We don't see that with cash assistance. But it's sort of something that we're going to follow up on to see if the sort of trends go together.
Yeah, and I also think something that's important to note, like just by looking at the graph, you can kind of see there are improvements, like there are periodic improvements just over like month over month. I think you kind of just we kind of need to give it more time to see, like as Claire said, if these trends hold, because even when it's at its worst, there are certain times where spontaneously, like you can see, like month over month, there can be a huge dip, but then that's followed by a drastic spike. So the core thing to focus on would be, are the conditions changing? Like, are there significant differences in the amount of cases? Are there significant differences in the amount of people that have processed those cases? That hasn't been the case. So while, particularly for SNAP, but even for cash assistance, you see some improvement. You would need more time to see like if that holds, or again, more and more applications will become more overdue. So that would be the best way to think about that.
Elena?
You mentioned that they cleared the backlog and that like advocates were like confused about like how that was able to happen. What did the administration or like the agency, like what was the explanation for how that occurred?
A combination of things. So one, they got a bunch of waivers to make things faster. So I didn't go into the process changes because there are many process changes, but they were able to, so you apply and then you have to recertify a period later. But it's a lot of the same steps. So they made the recertification process easier. If you don't have any income, the income reporting issues or requirements are simpler. And then they also waived some cases, the supervisors don't have to review them anymore. So their claim was that they had all these waivers. Advocates were concerned that it was the waivers plus rejections.
Yeah, and then some of it is also, according to HRA semantic, based on their previous system or based on the system they use, the definition of the term backlog was different than what it was in the legal aid suit. Backlog, regarding the lawsuit was essentially overdue applications, like we've been speaking about, cases that haven't been processed in a timely manner. Whereas according to HRA, they had defined backlog as something differently prior to that, so there were some issues regarding like what's the size of the backlog? Is the backlog still present? Is it not? That they believe
Yeah,
came
right.
down to, their staff and people examining their systems, misinterpreting what they define as backlog prior to the accumulation of the actual backlog.
And we did get the data the city is required to report to legal aid based on the lawsuit, how they're clearing old applications, and we do have that data. So you can see it getting better over time. There just are some drastic jumps. Right. I'm looking at the time and realizing I don't want to take up too much more time.
But you do have, so they do report to legal aid.
Mhm.
So there must be some sense of timing on how long some people have been in the system.
So you would think so. That is not in the benchmarks that they're giving.
Wow.
And I would also say a tricky thing is that all of HRA's data does cash assistance and SNAP, which you can't have somebody getting both cases, but they're processed separately because they're different requirements, especially if you're getting SNAP and the state cash assistance program. But legal aid's reporting is combining them in a way that isn't super useful for us.
And how often is this data updated? Because you're there through May.
Yeah, so this is data that we got from the city. So this is updated as we get it. The rejection data is updated quarterly, and the MMR is every year. So part of the reason we're also doing this is that the MMR is about to come out. And so this is trying to expand a bigger window into what will be just a single data point in the MMR.
Anybody else before we move on? Go ahead, well, Louise.
I just wanted to say, something to Wayne's point about data collection. So at IBO, we are increasingly aware that while we have charter mandated, commitments for city data, and we do our very best to make the city move along, there are lots of other data sources, that help us inform the policy research we're doing. And so we're doing increasing work on collecting from external sources that, in other words, non-governmental sources that are also involved in these policy challenges, which somewhat speaks to your point of what about the clients? And the other thing I wanted to say was that this work product is an amazing demonstration of IBO's different approach, because Cameron and Claire are not on the same team.
You would never know.
Cameron's on budget review and has great expertise, particularly in the staffing and how the city's structure and HR systems and FMS is structured, and Claire is on the social service team. So together they tell a very comprehensive story, but it's really exciting for IBO to have cross teams. So I want to involve that. And lastly, on the page 11, the last bullet, this is what IBO said publicly. Given the high number of new applications and ongoing cases in the last couple of years, cases are likely to remain high for the foreseeable future. To address this elevated caseload, HRA must find ways to improve recruitment, retention, and training, including potentially raising salaries for some of these positions. So that's IBO's opinion on how to address this issue, which is in general, moving forward, an area that IBO is focused on. What does the data tell us and how do we share that with the public? Okay.
Makes sense. Well, now you triggered another question. Henry referenced the 2-to-1. You're being told it's exempt by both the agency and OMB?
Yes, we haven't followed up. So because we've been working on this for a while, we met with HRA a year ago and asked them about because a bunch of civil service exams had been waived, and they said they waived them so they could try to hire up. But we haven't checked in more recently about sort of what the status is
Work
there.
due.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're meeting with them today, so we're gonna ask.
So it's timely, Henry.
Very timely.
Okay, upcoming publications.
Okay. We wanted to highlight work that we will be sharing in the next couple weeks, days, weeks. We have, reporting on the Department of Corrections with reports in budget, headcount and population. Have an explanation on school aid. We have our updated annual education indicators. And we are, complying and in the process of publishing our industrial and commercial abatement program ICAP analysis, which will also be presented at the Federal Reserve. And we have testimony coming up on cannabis enforcement and school safety officers, issues around DCAS and the funding. And of course, we're looking forward to the November plan, and we're thinking about how we might shift some of our mandated reporting around that. Any questions on upcoming publications? Again, I'd like to remind the public that beyond our mandated reports, the 55 to 60 reports we do a year that are by choice, you, the public, can ask us to do. And just write us, and soon we will have a new website. It'll be much easier to write us. And we are happy if we have the data and the ability to do the research to proceed. So we look forward to hearing from any and all.
I'll speak to outreach. We continue to interact with community boards, as you'll see on our list of what we've done since we spoke to you all in June. And I'll note that we had a successful co-sponsored event with CUNY on the qualitative report that ex-IBR Liza Pappas did on the least restrictive environment, on how schools manage giving access to least restrictive environments to students, to special education students. And that was both a presentation and a discussion event. I think it was held in June, if I'm not mistaken. And we've also done now 2 sessions of what we call school budget office hours, where basically we've communicated with community education councils, this offering where we have a couple of members of the education team just available and present to talk to anyone who has questions about their particular school budget. So we started it with a bit of a presentation, and then just basically opened ourselves to any particular questions people might have. We were using outbreak rooms to get people to if people had very specific questions, that we could offer them one-on-one help. And we hope to keep offering that. We're tweaking hours and when to do it and making sure people are coming. So we noticed there was a jump in people signing on at 6. So we probably should start a little early. So we're still figuring out the logistics of that. But the last one was pretty successful.
Timing wise, it's helpful because the next school year's budgets were recently released. So.
Yeah, and I know, I think Julia and then Caitlin, we had specific,
All the education.
yeah, had conversations with specific people trying to advocate for their community. So that was, we're gonna continue on that. Coming up, today, actually, Zach and Logan from the budget review team are gonna present on how the New York City budget works and who IBO is to AmeriCorps. Louise already mentioned that Richard and Elaine are going to be presenting on ICAP to the Federal Reserve Bank. And you'll see the very big event that we're going to be having coming up is the 35th anniversary of the creation of IBO. And it'll be an event at the New York Law School. It's co-sponsored with the New York Law School, and it's called 35 Years of Civic Engagement, reflecting on New York City's 1989 comprehensive charter reform and the birth of the IBO. So, invitations and RSVPs for that should be coming in the next couple of weeks.
Excellent. Questions?
Oh, and I did just want to point out one more
thing that's happening at school. Sarita is going to be giving an interview to BronxNet on Monday. And so it's an opportunity for us to introduce ourselves to the Bronx and emphasize that we're a resource for budgetary matters and that anybody can ask us questions or request studies.
Henry?
Yeah, so the New York City, thank you, charter amendment recommendations that are supposed to appear on the ballot in November has several recommendations to the public in terms of the voting. One of them is the Department of Sanitation taking over functions, well, at least the way it's presented in our view, for the entire cleaning operations of all the places. And I'm wondering if there has been an analysis of that, what the fiscal impact of that would be.
Not yet. We are aware of that expansion to overall city-owned property. We haven't looked into it yet.
But that's a great question. We'll take that as a request. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Thank you.
What time is the November 13th event?
Wayne, it's from 8:30 in the morning till 6. It involves breakfast, lunch, and dinner. 4 fascinating panels, an exciting keynote speaker, and maybe a birthday cake.
And a cocktail hour.
And a cocktail hour, but that's not, that is sponsored by New York Law School. That's
Yes,
not on
very
city
much.
money.
You should have started with a cocktail hour and not breakfast.
What's not a breakfast? But I think it's actually gonna be a really interesting day. Our focus is what was the intention of the 1989 charter in terms of what were the budgetary changes, what were the changes in economic development, the changes in community engagement, community and also equity issues. And so really having experts who were either present in 89 or subsequently have expertise to think about these central issues and address them through that lens of change. And perhaps particularly relevant because charter revision continues with, different years, different scale and scope of changes. 89 was an enormous level of change, as we know, partially initiated because of lawsuits, but frankly, also the city demonstrating an ability to push through massive reforms to government. So I think it'll be a really interesting day. We hope it'll be after Somos, so people will want something nice and chill. And November 13th, mark your calendars.
Great, thank you. And we're gonna keep going, upcoming.
Okay, we have a couple upcoming meetings for the advisory board. We have a strategic planning meeting. We have our next advisory board meeting on December 11th at 8:30. And again, we have our conference and keep an eye on your inboxes. We're working with New York Law School on the invite invitation, so we'll know exactly who the sender is and when shortly. Any questions on upcoming meetings?
Okay, that does it. Any remaining questions? All right, thank you all. Really excellent work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Sure. Terrific. Thank you. Yes.
Good job.